Good afternoon. My name is Joel Glassman. I'm the Vice President of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, and I will be our host for this afternoon's Great Decisions program. Great Decisions 2021 is sponsored by World Affairs St. Louis, and we'd like to express our thanks to the University of Missouri St. Louis, in particular their international office, UMSL Global, for their continued partnership in presenting this program. We thank them for their ongoing and continuous support. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects the St. Louis metropolitan region to the world for the purposes of generating understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. The Great Decisions program is a national program of the Foreign Policy Association, which was founded in 1918. The Great Decisions program itself has been provided by the Foreign Policy Association for more than 70 years. It creates an opportunity for U.S. audiences to learn about and understand the complex foreign policy issues of our time. The Foreign Policy Association and the Great Decisions program operate on the principle that an informed citizenry is essential for a functioning democracy. It has been the honor and privilege of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis to serve as the local sponsor or local presenter of the Great Decisions series for more than a decade. Our agenda for today will be as follows. We will view approximately 5 minutes of a video prepared by the Foreign Policy Association about today's topic. Then our keynote speaker, Professor George Zsidisin from the University of Missouri St. Louis, will present his thoughts about today's topic. That lecture will be followed by a Q&A session of about 20 minutes, and then we will view the balance of the video prepared by the Foreign Policy Association. Again, we will end by no later than 1:30. So let us begin with the introductory session to the Foreign Policy Association video.
Assembled in China. That's what it says on the box of the latest iPhone. But the full story is more complicated. Korean batteries, Japanese cameras, Taiwanese chips, German accelerometers, Congolese minerals, all pieced together in China and sold around the world. The globalization of supply chains has made manufacturing more efficient and consumer goods cheaper. But what happens when a crisis hits? Great Decisions explores the interconnected web of the modern economy, investigates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international trade, and asks whether the age of economic globalization might be coming to an end. Global supply chains and national security, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The ferocious spread of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020 caught hospitals unprepared.
I ain't seen nothing like this before in my life.
By April, with supplies dwindling, doctors and nurses around the country were rationing gowns and reusing face masks.
Our index case was March 1st. We knew by March 10th that we were going to be in significant trouble. We did not anticipate the profound disruption of the supply chain from China, where most of these masks came from. And as a consequence of that, we didn't just have a momentary disruption, we had a profound life-threatening disruption in our ability to procure supplies.
Widespread shortages of medical equipment called popular attention to just how much the American medical system relies on international trade.
Countries specialize in different types of equipment. Some of them export a lot of generic medicines like India and China, and protective equipment like masks or garments that help protect the healthcare workers. Those are mostly produced in China and Malaysia.
The pandemic has exacerbated long-standing concerns about how much the American economy relies on supply chains that pass through China.
We're clearly going through a period where people feel very vulnerable, and given the trade tensions with China, the U.S. is very sensitive about being reliant on China for any product or service at this point.
There's a very good reason why people started buying things from China. That was, you could go there and order anything in large quantities and get it relatively quickly. And that will be very difficult and expensive to undo.
Now, policymakers from both parties agree that the federal government must take action to secure critical supply chains.
There is a strong need for us to have reliability in our supply chain so we can take care of our own citizens should there be other health emergencies like this. And sadly, we can predict with near certainty that there will be other health emergencies like this.
Most nations that can will protect fundamental things like food supply, like medicine. Not every nation has that opportunity, but we do in the United States.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. George Zsidisin, who is the John W. Barriger Professor of Transportation Studies and the Director of Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Research Institute at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Professor Zsidisin's research focuses on how firms assess and manage risk associated with supply disruptions and price volatility in their supply chains. He is one of the founding members of the International Supply Chain Risk Management Network and co-editor emeritus of the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. Clearly, he's the exactly appropriate speaker for today's topic. We will follow his presentation with a Q&A session. If you want to ask questions, please note them on the Q&A function on this Zoom program, and I will sort the questions as they come in and direct them to Professor Zsidisin when he concludes his remarks. Let's move ahead now with Professor Zsidisin.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Glassman. It's my absolute pleasure to be here to share some of my thoughts on this very relevant topic that really affects each and every one of us. I also want to make sure to thank the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, as well as the continued support and work that we do with Liana Constantine and with Bob L. at UMSL Global. And it really highlights the fact that supply chains are truly global. And I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share those things that have occurred with COVID-19, how they've affected firms, but also how has it affected national security and how this may move forward as we go on. So I'd like to spend the first couple of minutes with a brief introduction, a little bit more, and then specifically with regard to our research institute, and then talk more about the effects of the pandemic on global supply chains and trade. We've seen a lot of challenges, but overall, I think the employees, the firms worldwide have done a phenomenal job in really sustaining society that we have today. But we'll discuss that as we move forward. And then its overall effects on national security itself. And I'd like to provide some perspectives of that as well. And as Dr. Glassman said, very much would appreciate any questions, discussions, points as we move forward after the initial discussion. So as Professor Glassman stated, I am the John Barriger Professor as well as the Director of the Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Research Institute, as we commonly say SCR3 to make it a little bit shorter. And as Dr. Glassman said, for the last 25 years of my career, really starting from even in my initial observations in industry, trying to understand how organizations assess and manage risk in their supply chains. How do you prepare for this? How do you think about it? And I've seen even from COVID-19, some firms have succeeded and have been able to manage their supply chains better than other firms. And then the other part that we're really starting to see highlighted even today due to COVID, dealing with issues such as commodity price volatility, where we've seen, for example, the prices of lumber more than double in the last couple of months. And other factors such as foreign exchange risk that have direct effects on organizations' profitability. So at SCR3, our purpose is to be the premier global institute for advancing knowledge and practice in mitigating risk and creating resilience in supply chains. And we are fortunate to collaborate with various industry, government, and education partners here in the St. Louis area and the great state of Missouri, but also reflecting what occurs in the global perspective, really from a global perspective, worldwide. And with our team, the Associate Director, Dr. Jill Bracey, as well as our Research Director, Professor Matthias Enns. And to further reflect the importance of understanding risk and resilience in the supply chain, we also have started working with global collaborators. Those are very well known scholars in risk and resilience, including scholars in Germany, Poland, Italy, and other countries as well, such as Finland. So getting really to the heart of our discussion today, the COVID-19 pandemic and supply chains. And we saw from that very brief video all of some of the issues of the barren streets, no one shopping at the retail outlets, challenges that have occurred with production, been able to actually handle the significant increases in demand, especially for PPE. So given the overall perspective of this has been in some ways similar to other disruptions we have seen in the supply chain. So if we think about this, they said in the video, they started understanding this at the hospitals in the very beginning of March. I have spoken with many supply chain professionals who started seeing the initial signs during December of 2019 with challenges that were occurring with regard to the delivery and the manufacturing occurring in China itself. So there were indicators that have occurred before, but this has been similar with others as well. The difference, I think, has really been the magnitude. If you think about it, it has not been that long in the past that we observed other types of health issues, such as the avian bird flu and SARS, for example. So this is not completely new. So we did have warning, but I think that part of the challenge was that many firms, at least initially, if they heard about this in December, January, did not realize how long this would actually impact society. We're still dealing with this today. I would prefer much to be able to speak with you face to face on this, but yeah, just given the pandemic, we've seen this a huge shift. It's been also similar as well with regard to almost any natural disaster that you see, other huge supply chain disruptions, such as September 11th that occurred, that the government at many different levels becomes involved and intervenes in some way or another. So again, this has not been different from other experiences we've had. The third one I think that's been very similar that we have seen is that it has had much more significant detrimental effect on many small and medium enterprises. Many of these firms have more significant challenges dealing with cash flows, and even a couple of good colleagues of mine who had small, medium enterprises, they unfortunately have lost their businesses due to COVID. Now, has it affected larger firms, Fortune 500 firms, truly global firms? Absolutely. But very often they'll have more resources they're able to recover and to find ways of creating greater flexibility, which is really going to be the key that we will speak about shortly. But I think it's also been different than other disruptions we have seen in the supply chain. For example, many of the other ones that we have seen, such as Hurricanes Rita and Katrina, September 11th, for example, the various tsunamis and earthquakes that have occurred in Asia, really throughout history, but even more recently in modern times. We've seen the detrimental effects of the infrastructures, the ability to actually use the roadways, for example, things that would affect, devastate the power grid. But we did not have this. This was really focused very hard detrimental effects on human beings. But when we're dealing with the infrastructure and the actual equipment, not so much. And then, of course, it's had a significant effect on the human resource capacity, the employees themselves. Even if an employee was healthy, was able to go to work, many of them could not because maybe they lived in the same house with a family member who had COVID or tested positive for COVID, and then they were quarantined for a minimum of 2 weeks. So that's really seen a little bit of a different effect, not as much on the equipment, but more on the human resource side of it. I will tell you, with regard to supply chain disruptions, I cannot think of one that has had such a huge scope, at least within my lifetime. You know, September 11th, I will say, had very huge effects, but many of the disruptions that we usually see are more localized, and you're able to find ways to work around it. Even when we think about very recently, we had the Suez Canal. It was a relatively temporary disruption. It affected a lot of global trade for approximately 10 days, a lot of inventory sitting on those boats. But again, not the same impact that we have and still are coping with today, dealing with COVID-19. We've also seen significant effects on overall demand for products. For some of them, they've absolutely skyrocketed. Anyone who's looking to purchase a house today, almost most markets today, the costs have absolutely ballooned. We've seen much more requirements or demand for types of products for people to be able to make home offices, for example. But even for some many staple products, we've seen significant shifts that have occurred in demand, but it was more due to the sources have changed. I think the example that we've seen the most relevant, or one of the most relevant, deals with the food, agriculture supply chains. So we had, for example, in the restaurants, they were disrupted for many months. And even today, not quite the same amount of business that they had pre-COVID time. And so we saw other types of companies, such as the grocery stores, have a huge boom in business because of more people purchasing those types of foods from the groceries and preparing them as well at home. Increases in the types of food like comfort foods have increased. So the demand has been very volatile for different types of products in the supply chain. And companies have had to adjust. You think, well, it's simple. We go from the distributors that provide the products to the restaurants. And then we shift it over now to the grocery stores and retailers. It's not so easy. You're changing the actual distribution lanes themselves. You're changing the packaging that is being utilized. Different laws have come into effect, especially early on, determining which businesses were critical, which were not critical. So you could be able to switch and have your business continue, but if you didn't have the packaging available, you were in a very constrained circumstance. And today, right now, in May, we're still coping with the effects of COVID-19. We're fortunate and happy that we're seeing the vaccines are being distributed. They've had their own, of course, supply chain challenges as well. But this is something that we're still going through today. And I cannot think of a disruption that has occurred quite as long as we have experienced. When we think about this from a global supply chain, in some ways, we were having challenges beforehand as well. For those that might remember, only a year and a half, 2 years ago, a lot of the topics and the discussions of supply chain management were talking about the traffic tariffs that were occurring, being imposed on China, other locations, trade wars that were occurring, and how that was affecting many of the prices and the availability of many types of commodities. We've been dealing with the EU and the issues of Brexit, for example. And really, it was not that long ago, only 13 years ago, we saw the issues with the EU and a lot of the financial crises that have occurred, such as with Greece and Italy, the cash flow challenges that were occurring, and how they were devastating the small industries and the small companies in these countries. And on top of this, I think we've also seen, especially throughout the entire pandemic, just such a heterogeneous response, types of responses are occurring within different countries themselves, the way Sweden handled it compared to Italy, compared to the United States. And I even think here in St. Louis, and I'm relatively new here in St. Louis, it's only finishing my second year here on the faculty at UMSL, but I even see within the state itself how different regions have had significantly different responses and different types of laws and restrictions that have occurred themselves, which makes managing these supply chains even more challenging. In doing a little bit of background research for this talk, I looked at several articles, and one of the graphs that really struck me was looking at the whole exports from 1 year in the past until this current year. So from 2000, so this was done actually a few months ago itself. And first we saw, and you saw with the video itself, how there was a huge drop off of the shipments coming in from China from the year over year. And we can see that from January, February, for example. But if we look at today, we've actually seen a massive growth in the amount of exports as compared to a year ago, with China truly leading the way. And in many ways, the US actually has even seen a further trade deficit that has occurred. I just saw a report that is now $74.4 billion. So we've seen this huge shift that's occurred, the initial reactions of almost trying to close these borders and having fewer shipments coming in. But now, if you think about it, we are so intertwined in our supply chains, and the manufacturing base in China is not going away anytime soon. And in the end, we will and continue to have a reliance globally. And I will tell you, I do not think that is so bad either. And I will continue my thoughts on this in a moment. When I was talking about the effects of how it's affected small and medium enterprises more significantly than the larger companies, I think we also have a parallel that has occurred when we think of overall the countries in the world itself. And that, I think that's really affected the overall smaller countries, those developing countries, the third world countries, even worse itself. I'm looking and thinking right now, the last 2 weeks, we've seen a significant spike of deaths and of the pandemic, from the pandemic in China, I'm sorry, in India, for example. But then also really due to the lack of travel and ability to travel to other countries, many of these developing, underdeveloped countries, some of them have really relied upon tourism for quite some time. And that is almost has been evaporated during the last year. And within this one report, I was able to uncover that we have seen, you know, they're expecting even greater amounts of extreme poverty moving forward. We're still learning from this, and we will learn from this for quite some time. But there is also, I think, some issues that we need to really address. One huge, I think, silver lining that we have seen in this, and we've been talking about global supply chains, but now going right into that local area. One of the toughest nuts for us to crack in supply chain management today, or has been in the past 15 to 20 years, is that last mile, or as I also like to say, the last kilometer, always thinking globally, of the supply chain itself, where it's always the most expensive and the most difficult, going to right to those consumers themselves. And we have seen a huge boost within that, almost the Uberization of the last kilometer of the supply chain. And in many ways, it's been the information systems and the information technologies that have helped facilitate this itself. Big data analytics, which we'll talk about shortly. I think another lesson that we have had is that from September 11th, more organizations started creating business and supply continuity plans. But not many firms have actually thought about it, at least with regard to a pandemic. Some might have had a little facet of that within their plans themselves, but the overall surge in demand for the personal protective equipment, and at times where some industries you just could not shut down. I remember I was fortunate enough to moderate a session that was sponsored with our Department of Supply Chain and Analytics during the first couple of months during the pandemic itself. And one of the companies there, Ameren, was describing their story. And if you think about Ameren, you have to keep that grid going. You have to have the energy for any society to be able to survive and thrive. They did a phenomenal job, and they were able to adjust and find ways of having their personnel get that personal protective equipment. But there were shortages that occurred in the short term itself, but we've seen also a bounce back. And this all comes back to the importance of creating flexibility and being adaptable. The tenets of supply chain risk and resilience, and specifically resilience, is enabled to do so. One way of doing is creating buffers, finding ways of buying time before you're able to resolve the circumstance. But in the long-term strategy is really creating that flexibility itself, mapping your supply chains and understanding itself, where can you actually create that flexibility, either in the bill of materials, those items that make up the products you make, and the sourcing strategies that you implement, the production strategies that you pursue. The common thread I see of this is really the role of technology as we move forward. So for those people my age, you will probably remember the biggest non-event 21 years ago of Y2K itself. Now, many organizations prepared 2, 3, 4 years in advance for that. But I think whatever happened is if we actually, if there was a big lever and all of a sudden the internet was shut down, I think that would be a significant challenge that we would have trying to manage our supply chains moving forward. Other things I have to say, the good and bad of it, more and more people, especially more of the types of jobs, more the managerial jobs, are able to do the work from home. to do the types of analyses, the meetings itself. In many ways, we've seen some efficiencies created within this and within organizations to reduce travel. But to me, whenever I think about supply chain management, as very, very specifically global supply chain management, it becomes a focus on those relationships. And those relationships are absolutely key to be able to create greater efficiencies and have more effective supply chains, and to be able to understand what your supply chains look like. And we might have a challenge with that moving forward. Maybe I'm old school in my thoughts, but to me, to have those relationships, you really need to have some of that face-to-face time. Now I want to shift for a couple of minutes looking at this from national security. So I will tell you right now, my expertise is on supply chain risk and resilience. I am not an expert in national security, but I do have a few thoughts from a supply chain perspective I'll be very happy to share with you. Whenever I think of supply chains, there's always three flows that occur. It's the product flows that go from Mother Earth all the way to the final products that we consume or support the services that we consume. And then some of those products eventually come back through what's called reverse logistics in the supply chain itself. So the aluminum cans, for example, may be recycled as an easy example. But there's always financial flows. Suppliers are not going to provide companies or their customers products for free. And without those financial flows, supply chains will not occur. The third one that I think sometimes has been underappreciated as an absolutely critical flow is those information flows that occur among the organizations themselves. I would argue that with regard to national security, September 11th was really our wake-up call with regard to the products themselves, where actually even our transportation assets could be utilized as weapons. And then we formed the Department of Homeland Security. We ended up having programs such as CTPAT, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, combination with the government, with corporations, with industry, to find ways of trying to create greater security in our supply chains. Within the financial crisis that we noticed 13 years ago or thereabouts, we started seeing more of the development of the fintechs, the financial technical firms, but also the criticality of those finances with regard to the cash flows to the suppliers. We saw in some parts where some suppliers were having to wait 90, 120 days for payments, and they would become financially starved. And it really helped develop a whole set of tools of how we're going to better manage supply chain finance, going just beyond the focus of an individual firm itself. I think that COVID-19 in part has really highlighted the absolute criticality of the information flows that occur in the supply chain. And this is really what's making supply chains run today, and really feeds the big data analytics that we're able to utilize with our computing power today, with the predictive analytics that we have, to be able to sense when something may be potentially going wrong and resolving that issue before it occurs in the first place. So unfortunately, I do see from a national security side, there will continue to be threats to all three of those supply chain flows. But I would also say that COVID-19 has in some ways highlighted that importance of those information flows. When we think about these last mile supply chains, now where there's more and more data points are going out to more and more organizations themselves. Could that have an effect? Possibly. I would say one of our greatest potential national security issues is going to deal with cybersecurity as we move forward, because we are just so connected, and with the companies, the ERP systems that we have, the linkages firms have electronically with each other, the Internet of Things, that's IoT, and then how they all start linking together with Industry 4.0. Now we do have many firms are very aware of those cybersecurity threats that occur. But I can see this as being a potential weakness as we move forward. You know, we've heard of the fake news, for example. Also, I read about this and I've seen this myself. I mean, now with this long hair, you wouldn't know it, but I served for 7 years in the U.S. Army. And I've also read the stories of how the pandemic has negatively affected U.S. military training readiness. And then you think about ultimately safety as well. You know, we had exercises, for example, that were supposed to occur in Norway that were canceled. So I think it has some effect on it. And then we've also seen issues that have occurred as well with more of the civil disruptions that have occurred in the past year, a year and a half time frame, that it could be perceived as affecting national security. So where I want to bring this, kind of wrapping these up, is that the video started talking about, are we going to start to reshore the items as well, nearshoring the items? And we have actually seen some of a trend toward that over the last 10 years or thereabouts. Will global trade decline? Is that the question? I want to tell you, I think it's only going to increase as we move forward. We are so connected in our supply chains globally. And this is nothing new. I always ask my students, when has global supply chain management started? It's really ever since the very beginning of businesses. I would argue that global supply chains have existed for millennia. So in many ways, this is not quite new. In some ways, it's just a level of connectivity. We have never seen any of this occur before. But what I would argue that is the reshoring, the nearshoring is really partly driven by firms needing to create greater flexibility when a disruption can occur in the supply chain, having their options that are open itself. When I'm thinking about this, is there going to be expanding government influence, intervention? Well, it's occurred for quite some time. And they talk about, do we want to reshore just the critical supply chains? Just about every supply chain is global. If you look at either the bill of materials, you know, second, third tier suppliers, you map supply chains, not just for the direct items, but also those indirect items that help support production. Almost all of them are global in some way or another, or affected by what occurs in the world. And I cannot see this decoupling anytime soon. We have Japanese plants here in the United States. The US has plants throughout the entire world. There's German plants that exist here. I just think about company, we have Bayer that's right here, for example, a German company, for example. We are truly global in our supply chains, and we should be, in my opinion. So I think there might be a little bit of the quick reaction saying, will global trade decline? I think we start seeing from some of the charts that in many ways it's going to continue as we move forward. And that we might want to think about having strategic reserves, but in the end, we're always going to be exposed to some extent to global supply chains. And the government, I mean, they're still going to do what they want to do, and it seems to have changed by the administration what's going to be their respective priorities. The bottom question is, who should lead the efforts for creating this resilience? In my viewpoint, it is the companies who understand their supply chains the best. They know who their suppliers are. They understand facets of the locations where those suppliers, the environment that they are in. Good supply chain professionals are going to work toward mapping critical aspects of their supply chain. So in many ways, I think it really needs to be industry that kind of leads the way itself, that we're going to continue having this global presence itself. It's not going to go away anytime soon. But in the end, I think it is us that we do choose our fate of how we want to go about this itself. In the end, us in business and industry, we have to react to whatever the government dictates and the policies that they enact. But in the end, it's the companies that really will know their supply chains the best in the long term. So as we move forward, our research institute, we're still recruiting corporate members. I'll be happy to talk to anyone who may be interested in being a corporate member of SCR3. But right now, we have a research program that's underway in creating a taxonomy of understanding of all of those rich drivers from a global perspective. what are the specific techniques and tools firms utilized to create resilience during one of the biggest challenges in our lifetime. And as well as I'm working with 3 other colleagues from Denmark and from Germany on a co-edited book with Springer Publishers, and really collecting cases of how firms have been able to survive, in many ways thrive during these most challenging times. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to share some of my thoughts with regard to global supply chains and during the pandemic, as well as maybe some effects with regard to global security. And I'll be very happy to address any questions that you have at this time.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. We have a few questions already in hand. It probably would be helpful if you took your slides down.
Oh, perfect. I was trying to see how I was working.
One of our audience members was obviously taken by your suggestion that it would be possible in some kind of emergency for the internet to disappear. What kind of impact would that have on supply chains?
I think they would stop, they will halt to a grind. You might have a couple of very local supply chains with only a couple of links that might be able to survive a short period of time. But I cannot think of one organization that is not reliant on the internet or some type of electronic connections within their firms, let alone their supply chains. If that internet went down and we had to immediately go back to calling people up or other ways of modes of communication, I think it would actually grind our supply chains to an absolute halt. I always think back to 2 things that really helped create supply chains today was containerization and really the advent of the internet today. You know, we were more limited back in the 30s, 40s, and early 1950s within our global supply chains themselves. We saw massive growth because of the standardization with the containers, and then now being able to communicate 24 hours a day in real time from a global perspective. I can't see how supply chains would be able to at least survive in the short term without the internet today.
Another member of our audience wanted you to review the issue of the impact, both short-term and long-term, of COVID-19 on global supply chains.
Yes, so we saw, I think, the very short-term impact was that now all of a sudden we closed up some of these global supply chains due to certain edicts that had occurred. And so there were some disruptions, but I don't see global supply chains going away anytime soon. I think in some, like we saw now, there's been even further increase in the amount of exports as compared to last year coming from China throughout the world, for example. I think this has really highlighted the importance in many ways how truly interconnected our supply chains are globally. And that when we think about this from a global perspective, it does provide opportunities. We could think about it from a US basis, that global supply chains also offers us the opportunities to increase our revenues, to be able to sell to other countries. I think about really our food supply chains and how much we export, for example. People will always need to eat. We have a phenomenal competency and be able to grow and be able to distribute those food products on a global basis. I cannot see this going away anytime soon. I think really this is going to, we saw a little bit of protectionism in the beginning, but I think in the long term, we're going to see really is supply chains are even going to be more global as we move forward. I cannot see it going any other way.
It seems to me that one of the few things that the Biden and Trump administrations agreed upon was the need to nationalize some essential items or the production of some essential items. it strikes me also that if we did that, it would increase the cost of those essential items. How do you weigh the national security versus increased cost of protecting our supplies of certain essential materials?
I think it comes back to flexibility and being able to have adaptable supply chains. It is no, whatever the source may be, if there's a sole source where there's only one supply source available globally, you will always be exposed to that form of risk. And that in supply chain management, in the end, I think we really need to focus what are our options, and to include dealing with national security. It's always the weakest link, though, and that's where it becomes really, I think, the challenge. We could talk about certain items that need to be critical, that need to stay domestic itself. I wouldn't say that's a wrong perspective, but we can't stockpile everything either. You could eventually get to the point saying that almost everything becomes critical, or most things become critical in the supply chain itself. I think that was one of the things that was highlighted during COVID-19 that we didn't quite realize, how quickly we'd run out of certain items themselves. So I could understand the need for a stockpiling, or at least having some degree of capability. The challenge becomes for some of the products that are produced, the enormous fixed costs that are involved with the research and development, the enormous costs associated with the tooling, creating the manufacturing facilities for the items themselves. So to me, I think it's going to really have to be driven in the end by industry understanding, okay, to include the medical industry. All right, this is where our supply chains currently reside today. Does it make sense for some companies to be able to build some of those capabilities, maybe at a higher cost, but they could also be more responsive, more reactive? So cost is one element. It's always going to be an important element, but there's also other elements that really facilitate successful supply chains. You can have the lowest cost price, but if it takes you 9 months to be able to have it produced and shipped to you, very often it's going to be too late for your needs, of course, depending upon what that product is itself. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps. How would you compare U.S. planning for the future of global supply lines versus Chinese efforts to prepare for the future of the global supply chains? Certainly the Chinese investment in international transportation networks seems to be greater than our own.
It's, I think, becomes a question of centralization versus decentralization. So in China, it's much more centralized. The process is the government and what they encourage for the various companies to pursue, what to manufacture, the respective industries for them to build upon. In the US, we are more decentralized in our approach itself. But Joel, you bring up a very interesting point dealing with infrastructure, and infrastructure is always going to be a key element. I'm actually very happy. I'm a member of what's called MCT, the Missouri Center for Transportation Innovation, that looks very specifically at that with regard to the infrastructures here that we have in Missouri itself. I was actually speaking about this last night with a good friend of mine with regard to, I always think back to the Eisenhower interstate system. And in many ways, that really helped open up many of our supply chains and create a lot of efficiencies in those supply chains. Is China making investments in their infrastructure? Absolutely, they're continuing to do so. But then we've seen now with our most recent administration, there's been a recent push toward that as well, at least being introduced, having significant reinvestments in our overall infrastructure. And that infrastructure will always be critical to be able to effectively and efficiently run our supply chains today. I just would, of course, question is that, with those investments that we're going to have from the government, is it really going to infrastructure, or are there going to be many other ride-ons that occur? But I think we're doing some of those investments as well. I think the difference is really the way that we do business in the United States, where it's going to be really more industry driven and not more decentralized, and not so much from the government dictating which companies should operate and what they should do.
One of our audience members is asking about, what about the supply chain of rare earth metals?
Of what? I'm sorry?
Rare earth metals.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, that's our need for that is not going to go away anytime soon. And that's always an odd misnomer, was the rare earth metals, but you can source them from other locations. It's just the processing is just so dirty, and it has very, very significant environmental detrimental effects on the natural environment itself. So that is going to be a weakness as we move forward, because we are more reliant upon a couple of regions of the world for those rare earth metals themselves. But again, this is going to be really trying to understand where are those various options, and will other options start to emerge. Once there's a overall opportunity that is identified, a gap, there's usually going to be some firm or some entrepreneur is going to find a way of exploiting that gap and creating that competition itself. Sometimes it just takes longer than we would like.
Can I ask the audience to send the questions through the Q&A function? That way I only have to monitor one of the functions. I'm going to read this next question to you because I think I asked it already incorrectly. The sun could put out an electromagnetic pulse as it did about the year 1911. This pulse could shut down all computers. Do we have a plan for this contingency?
I'm sure somebody does, but I can tell you, I personally do not have such a plan for that. And I've actually heard about that before. I like that you brought that up, because that does highlight that these disruptions and the effects can occur from so many different sources that it's really darn hard to be able to imagine all of those. Hence why many people did not quite predict or think about what occurred here with COVID-19. Not many people, and we experienced this a century ago itself. So I think that would have devastating effects, but I don't really know. No one has told me, said, George, our company has come up with a plan that if we had a slow solar flare. I have not heard that, but I'm sure it does exist for some companies or some people.
Our next question is, the move from just-in-time to just-in-case going to be long-term? What will a just-in-case scenario actually look like?
There's actually been some recent articles I've seen with people arguing, is this going to be the death of lean? Well, lean systems, lean production, lean supply chains, the base of it requires that almost all uncertainty is eliminated. And that is a pretty darn hard thing to do itself. No one knows or can predict the future perfectly. But we've seen a lot of the benefits from that. I think there are some supply chains that are more reliable, more predictable, where we do not necessarily have to hold all that additional inventory still to be able to buffer ourselves from those disruptions. But there's always going to be a need for inventory. That's something that's never going to go away in our lifetime itself. It's very hard to actually perfectly align multiple processes among multiple organizations that is able to eliminate that inventory and have a ordering size of one each and every time, because that's what eventually the goal of lean is, that you only order one exactly when it's needed and at no other time. It's never been fully possible. Many organizations such as Toyota were some of the leaders with the lean practices, and that we have seen a lot of benefits of reducing some of that extraneous waste. But I think it's that ever search for understanding what can disrupt our supply chains, understanding the flows of those supply chains, and that not all supply chains are necessarily going to have the same inventory levels based upon that demand volatility that we see. So different components have different levels of demand volatility. So we have to understand it really sometimes at that component level and not just within one firm itself.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you, George, for your very flexible response to these questions. That's a good takeaway from your presentation, that these supply chains may need not to be brought home or renationalized, but made more flexible for the future. So I think that's something for us to chew on after this session. I know you'd like to join me, all of you, in thanking Professor Zsidisin for his presentation and his willingness to answer all of our questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glassman. It's been my absolute pleasure. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has participated in today's session. And please feel free to contact me. If you look at my last name, there's not that very many of them out there. But if you'd like to further discuss, very, very happy to continue the conversation moving forward. Thank you very much, Dr. Glassman.
Thank you. We're going to begin our video in just 1 second. I want to remind you that our program will be back on 2 weeks from today on May 20th with Dr. Park Chun-moo from Pyongyang University for Science and Technology. Dr. Park will speak about North-South Korea peace diplomacy through science and technology cooperation. Let's now turn towards the balance of the Foreign Policy Association video about global supply chain and national security. And thank you for joining us today. And please consider becoming a member of World Affairs St. Louis. Your memberships make it possible for us to continue to present these high quality programs to you. Good afternoon.
The man who changed the global economy forever was a truck driver from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. In 1956, McLean experimented with a new way to move cargo directly between trucks and ships, stacked efficiently and never needing to be repacked. The modern shipping container was born.
This cargo is going into a steel container called a cargo van. The cargo vans are proving especially useful in the safe shipment of small cargo that's more susceptible to pilferage or damage in handling.
It was actually the evolution and the introduction of the shipping container that fundamentally transformed and lowered by an order of magnitude the cost of shipping and transportation of goods all over the world.
Almost the entire post-war period up until the early 2000s was a golden time for international trade. Deeper engagement in international trade yielded a tremendous growth.
In the 1990s, the digital revolution spurred globalization still further. Increasingly, it was possible to manage far-flung operations over the internet.
The digital revolution created modern global value chains because with computer technologies and the falling costs of communications, it became possible for companies to break up production to maximize both cost efficiency and quality by locating wherever in the world made the most sense.
So for example, Bombardier is a Canadian plane maker, and they make parts of their business jets in central Mexico, and the rest they make in Quebec. And before the internet, there was no way they could make the tails in Mexico and the rest of the plane in Canada and hope they would fit together when you were trying to coordinate this with airmail letters and faxes.
I believe that this pandemic is going to leave us with several lessons. One is that there's greater risk to have all your employees in one place. And number two is you can achieve good efficiency because of the advances in technology, connectivity, use of the web, use of the cloud.
As the 21st century dawned, the patterns of international trade were transformed by the controversial decision to integrate China into the global economy.
In opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies.
It's the Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives that voted overwhelmingly against granting most favored nation status to China. At that time, the business interests that were for it said that granting that status would increase our trade deficit by only $1 billion a year. They were off by 30,000%.
Products are made abroad for a reason. It tends to be more efficient to do that, and we benefit enormously as consumers. You know, the cost of the things we consume has come down dramatically over the last 4 or 5 decades. But I think it is fair to say that trade competition is one of the things that has contributed to a decline in manufacturing in the United States.
Today, those who have watched the integration of the global economy most closely warn that the genie of globalization, once let out of the bottle, would be impossible to put back in.
If the U.S. just suddenly tried to dramatically decouple from China by cutting off all supplies, it's not going to work. Nobody has the manufacturing capacity that China does today, and U.S. consumers are going to pay a very heavy price if we try to sever those ties.
Historically speaking, the supply chains were made cost-effective over time. It's a natural evolution, and it's not going to disappear.
As calls for the reshoring of key industries ramp up, experts warn that policymakers must proceed with caution.
We need to be careful and thoughtful about which sectors of the economy we would like to bring home to the United States.
I think it goes back to what are the things you couldn't live without? I think certainly medicine and medical supplies would be one of them. I certainly think food is one of them. And I think energy is also one of them.
With the memory of the acute shortages from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic still fresh, many stakeholders insist that the U.S. government should use its national security powers to promote domestic manufacture of medical equipment.
We need a national strategic plan on that. I feel very strongly that, based on this experience, that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on domestic manufacturing, period. That is a vital interest to this country, and I would say is a national security interest.
We do have a precedent in the country for demanding that certain supply chains of critical material be made in the United States. So, for example, we don't manufacture weapon systems in other nations unless they're allies. We won't manufacture them in adversary nations. We won't buy them from adversaries. We've never defined medical equipment as a critical national security supply chain, but I think the pandemic has demonstrated that we have to rethink that.
The United States is one of the biggest producers of medical equipment in the world. The US, Germany, and Switzerland are the 3 biggest exporters in the world. The production comes from different places, depending on the product. Now, I think the problem is if everybody wants to manufacture everything domestically, that's simply not doable.
The pandemic has also raised questions about how reliably Americans can access vital medicines in a time of crisis.
The big concern is that some critical sort of key ingredients that go into certain patent medicines, and those ingredients are sourced on a bulk basis within China. As a result of perhaps trade friction, there's been some restriction in terms of the availability of these feedstocks from Chinese factories, and thus we're starting to see, for certain types of medicines, shortages at retail pharmacies.
It's not just the manufacturing of the products themselves, but it's actually the containers in which these products will be shipped to us, the glass vials, the syringes, etc., for which demand has clearly already outstripped supply. It's also really hard to make these products de novo and in short order.
But some experts warn that those who champion self-sufficiency should be mindful of the painful lessons learned by other countries that have tried to control their domestic food supplies.
I'll give you an example. Argentina wanted to protect its beef, and they didn't want their agricultural sector to be exporting beef and making all this money while locals could not find beef. The Argentine beef business is smaller. They are not producing to full capacity. It is less profitable. Some people are going out of business.
In the British case, one of the great pushes for national self-sufficiency after 1945 came in food. The United Kingdom was unique amongst the large countries in the world in that it imported something like half its food. Now, that was thought to be dangerous in the eyes of many people.
Playing a magnificent part in restocking our larders, New Zealand is going all out to send every possible ton of meat to Britain. Records are made and broken as the food drive goes on, and it isn't only meat. Thousands of tons of New Zealand butter and apples are also filling the holds.
Through protection, through investment, the output of food increased very dramatically, such that by the 1980s, the United Kingdom was essentially self-sufficient. So the result actually was that British people ended up eating relatively expensive food, and really only the sort of food that you could grow in this country. So I don't think it was especially good for the British diet that we had self-sufficiency in the 1970s and 1980s.
For economists and policymakers, the most concerning supply chains are those that feed high-tech manufacturing, a sector where countries around the world often rely on components produced in China.
The more challenging issue and the more difficult issue is not PPE or masks. It's sort of what to do with some of these, tech supply chains, other high-end goods, things like electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors. Those are the products that also have a pretty globalized supply chain.
We've increasingly seen a convergence of commercial technologies and defense technologies and national security related technologies. We have huge vulnerabilities because of those dependencies on China.
Many experts worry that China's control over the supply of key minerals could put the U.S. at a disadvantage.
Exhibit A in that today would be rare earth materials, which are critical for pretty much every high technology application, from smartphones to electric cars to military applications of all sorts. China is the source of 80+% of the rare earth production in the world, not because rare earths are actually all that rare, but because the mining of them is very dirty and environmentally damaging, and the Chinese have been more willing to do this than other countries.
In 2010, they basically cut off our supplies of rare earths. That's a vulnerability that we have to address. These are the sorts of determinations that we have to make, partly at a political level, partly at an economic level, to determine how much we need to return to the United States.
American politicians from both parties have also tried to challenge China's dominance in the manufacture of solar panels.
This is for solar products, so that we'll be making solar products now, much more so in the United States. Our companies have been decimated, and those companies are going to be coming back strong.
But the parts that go into solar panels are produced by a complex global supply chain.
What we've witnessed in the United States since the tariffs have been implemented on solar panels is a corollary implication for a rise in cost for some of those domestic producers. The business of developing the solar industry here becomes very complex if you're not able to import low-cost products. One solar industry body actually posits that these tariffs, which have been implemented, have starved the U.S. industry of 62,000 jobs and $19 billion in capital.
We can argue on the one hand, maybe it's not a good thing that we have all the solar panels being made in China. But on the other hand, unless we're able to replicate that scale and capacity in another country or in the United States, it's very hard to argue against the positive side of it, which is a huge drop in solar prices.
As trade tensions with China grow, experts debate to what extent concerns about China can be mitigated by diversifying supply chains to other countries.
China is no longer the lowest wage economy in the world, and so people have been moving factories out of China and into Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Mexico, and so there has been a natural diversification as people move away from China. I think that's healthy.
You can expect to see a diversification of supply chains moving forward. But one thing I will say about China is that there are many companies that are still engaged in China and indeed even increasing their investments in Chinese manufacturing. But it's primarily because of the growth of the domestic Chinese consumer.
You may not be able to have your full supply chain in your country, but if you're going to have it in another country, you want it to be one where there is geographic proximity. So in our case, we'll probably have more supply chains closer in Mexico or in Canada when they can't be in the US.
The best answer is to diversify, is to have a supply chain that is all over the world so that companies and governments don't depend on input that comes from one country or from one region.
With the most acute disruptions of the early COVID-19 pandemic in the rearview mirror, experts question whether the measures put in place to mitigate its effects might have enduring consequences for the world economy.
In the early phase of the pandemic, there was this huge scramble for medical supplies. Quite a large number of countries imposed some sorts of export restrictions on those. Those kinds of restrictions have largely faded away in terms of importance because we don't have this big shortage of medical supplies anymore.
There are restrictions that have been ongoing and intensifying even before COVID. And that may not change even when COVID is resolved.
Many countries already have restrictions on the export or even import of national security intensive goods or goods that are regarded as being important to national security. In the moment, they're a temporary expedience. But I think the experience of the pandemic is almost certainly going to lead many countries, including the United States, to try to impose more serious restrictions.
In a broader sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified long-standing frustrations with an economy built on global trade.
What was happening before coronavirus was this move toward protectionism, move toward self-reliance, the tariff war, the trade war. And then on top of that came COVID. So that just added to the problems.
Free trade was in trouble before COVID. Many Americans and many people around the world were beginning to question the merits of free trade and whether free trade has indeed provided economic benefits to all members of its societies. But there's no doubt that COVID has accelerated concerns about free trade.
At a time when the benefits and drawbacks of trade have become a contentious part of the national political debate, some observers now wonder whether the era of free trade is over.
There's no question that the benefits of globalization are under fundamental attack. From the perspective here in the United States, we were winners for a long time. The last 30 years or so, relatively speaking, we've been the losers. Other countries are gaining more from trade than we are. I think what we're seeing is a partial turning inward, perhaps a correction from maybe a period in which we were over-globalized, somewhat too dependent on imports in a variety of different places.
Obviously, there's been a disillusionment with the most extreme manifestations of free trade, but I don't think that the American public is buying this. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. If we're becoming more and more efficient in manufacturing goods with fewer workers, the only way we can expand jobs is to open markets around the world.
They say it's a matter of time, 1,000 days and the sun won't shine before I come back to you.
Analysts are eager to draw attention to the work behind the scenes that, despite the upheavals and uncertainties of the pandemic, has kept hospitals supplied and supermarkets stocked.
The U.S. supply chain for pharmaceutical-based products is unparalleled in the world. It is really the gold standard. Although the pandemic has stressed our system, it has remarkably held up very, very well to these stresses.
I will say that the private sector has done quite an amazing job to be able to get the supplies that we have today. And if you go to a grocery store, you'll see some out of stocks, but it is quite an accomplishment that you see the number of products that are there. And in order for those products to get there, there had to have been a tremendous amount of work and rework on a supply chain.
Around the world, consumers have become accustomed to the advantages of an economic system that has become astonishingly efficient. Cheaper goods, bigger selections, and faster delivery. But economic interdependence brings new risks. The hard-learned lessons of the COVID pandemic will loom large in the years to come as policymakers, economists, and business leaders work to prepare for the next great crisis.
Nothing's going to stop me. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way. I go so low. Oh, I go so low. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.